Welcome to Trash Talk Reverse. I'm Harry, and today we're going to be watching the Season 2 finale of Game of Thrones. Last episode was a great one, and on the whole, this season has been a massive step up from last season. This episode will probably pick up with the aftermath of the battle, with definitely some Tyrion, Tywin, and Cersei. Also, the Hound has taken off, and I have no idea when we'll see him next until he catches up with Arya in Season 4. Arya we should definitely be seeing again in this episode, as it's titled Valar Morghulis. Then there's Sansa, who chose not to go with the Hound, so we'll see what happens with her. Should also be seeing Robb and Talisa, and hopefully Catelyn again. Maybe a bit of Theon. I feel like we'd probably have to check in with Stannis and Davos. We might also catch up a bit with Brienne and Jaime, and we'll definitely be catching up with Jon and Dany. I think I said earlier this season I thought the Season 2 finale would have Lord Commander Mormont's death, but given where the Night's Watch storyline is right now, I feel like that can't really be a possibility until next season. All I remember is that it happens near the end of a season and Jon's not around to deal with it. There's just so much that they could possibly cover in this finale, so it'll really come down to a balancing act in order to make sure this episode is both cohesive and impactful. Last season's finale was the best episode of the season, and while Blackwater might be hard to top as Season 2's best, maybe this finale will manage. This season has typically done really well with managing storylines across the seasons and within each episode, so without further ado, let's jump into the Season 2 finale of Game of Thrones.
I am very much alive. Stannis Baratheon suffered a stunning defeat at the hands of your father. You are no longer a hand of the king. For your trouble.
That's definitely one way to start an episode. I knew we'd probably be picking back up with Tyrion and the fallout of everything that just happened. I guess this is sort of the beginning of the end for Tyrion's association with the Lannisters, right? Because he's already getting screwed over, not being hand anymore. So I think this episode and then in the whole of next season, we'll see what leads us to get from here to being accused of killing Joffrey. And it'll be interesting to see how Tywin interacts with him in this episode, when in the last season's finale, he was basically like, you're basically the last Lannister hope right now. Though remember, Tywin did say, you'll be hand of the king in my stead. He's here now, so I guess technically this was always going to happen, but I feel like there's going to be a bit of a gut punch thrown in there somewhere, because if I'm remembering correctly, I think Tyrion gets sort of blamed for not being able to win, or for needing Tywin and Loras's help to win.
Savior of the city and the hand of the king.
Thank you, your grace.
Did he need to be on a horse for that?
Ingenuity in uniting the houses of Lannister and Tyrell. I declare that you shall be granted the castle of Harrenhal to be held by your sons and grandsons.
I shall have to acquire some sons.
Very me. It's interesting because remember earlier in the season, Tyrion fake promised Harrenhal to Littlefinger, and now Joffrey's able to give Littlefinger what Tyrion wasn't able to give. I don't know if this was an intentional choice by the writers, but I really like seeing small details like that come back in order to symbolically represent what's going on the larger scale, which is where basically Tyrion is losing his power in this court.
Your house has come to our aid. The whole realm is in your debt, none more so than I. If your family would ask anything of me, ask it.
My sister Marjorie, her husband was taken from us before. She remains innocent.
Are they not going to address the fact that the Tyrells were on Team Renly not too long ago? Like, yeah, we've established the Tyrells are rich as hell, so of course the Lannisters would want to join up with them and have them on their side, but just for the sake of publicity, everyone knows that the Tyrells sided with someone who opposed Joffrey being on the throne, and that's something Joffrey would probably not be content with being unaddressed. I think he easily could have said thanks a lot, but how can we trust you when you joined with Renly in the first place? And I do trust that Joffrey would know enough to not flip out on them, but maintain some sense of propriety, because he knows that his grandfather is the one who brought them here, and then they could have given some explanation, offered the betrothal, or better yet, Tywin could have stepped in, which brings me to my next point. Where the hell did Tywin go? I don't know why the writers just had him leave. He should have stayed, which could show him getting into his new role as Hand of the King. He not only could have publicly vouched for the Tyrells, but we could also see the new dynamics forming, with Cersei and Tywin exchanging looks, and Varys seeing that, which is important because of all their relationships with Tyrion.
I have come to love you from afar.
Tales do not do you justice. It would be an honor, but I am promised to another. A king must keep his word.
Be neither proper nor wise for you to wed the daughter of a man beheaded for treason, whose brother is in open rebellion against the throne. As we speak, your counselors beg to set Sansa Stark aside. The way Cersei's talking about this suggests the council already had a meeting about this prior to this public thing, and we can assume that off-screen, Cersei and Tywin came to some sort of agreement with the Tyrells ahead of time. Obviously, Joffrey wasn't there or this scene wouldn't be happening, and clearly he wants Marjorie, like he's not hiding that at all. So it almost makes me wish I could have seen Cersei's reaction in that council meeting when they discussed that Joffrey would be cool with it, just because of the difficulty she's been having with controlling her son this season, and also her reaction to the fact that Sansa Stark would no longer be marrying her son, because of the way Cersei's almost low-key been bonding with her this season, drawing parallels between her situation with Robert and Sansa's situation with Joffrey. But I understand why they didn't show any of that, because even though it would have been interesting to see the culmination of two of Cersei's relationship arcs this season, it essentially would have been repeat information, and cutting right to the public hall and dealing with it there creates a more compelling scenario, with Cersei saying all this in front of Sansa in public, with the Tyrells proposing the marriage bond in front of everyone. Like, it makes sense the way they did it this way, and it delivers on the writer's purpose.
I would like to heed your wishes and the wishes of my people, but I took a holy vow.
The gods do indeed hold betrothal solemn. Your father made this pact before the Starks revealed their falseness. Their crimes against the realm free you from any promise you have made to them.
I will gladly wed wed your sweet sister.
So remember, this whole season, Cersei's been having a problem controlling Joffrey, except on the matter of marrying Sansa Stark. He never showed he understood why he had to marry her, just that his mommy told him that he had to. Now he's like, well, I can't break my betrothal because of the gods. Dude, what? I don't know why the writers needed to add in this whole thing about the gods. Even if this is something that's in the books, it's literally not necessary. He could have just said, I'm promised to another. Then Cersei could have come in with her thing about you can't marry someone whose brother's in open rebellion, and then Pycelle could come in with your dad made this arrangement before he knew. No need to mention the gods here, specifically because the show has not established Westeros to be a deeply religious society with rules about betrothals being under the side of the gods or whatever. The religion in this show pretty much only pops up when the plot needs it to. And they especially haven't established Joffrey caring about that sort of thing anyway. At the very least, they should have shown him earlier in the season understanding that he had to marry Sansa because of Robb. It's not like he would bring that up in public, but that would have given him some groundwork for why he's like, well, I'm promised to another, and that makes him look like a man of his word to his public. I get they kept Sansa here instead of having her go with the Hound because this scene is just more impactful if it's in front of Sansa and in public, but it's still really annoying. Also, she looks real happy, but does she think they'll just let her go? Like, yeah, you don't have to marry terrible ass Joffrey, but you're still a prisoner. Like, you know that, right?
He'll still enjoy beating you, and now that you're a woman, he'll be able to enjoy you in other ways.
If he's not marrying me,
He'll let you go home.
This is good because it gives Sansa the chance to voice her thoughts, and now I know that, yeah, she really did think the Lannisters would just let her be free.
You have a tender heart, just like your mother did at your age. I can see so much of her in you.
He's so creepy, bruh. Get away from her.
I'll help get you home.
King's Landing is my home now.
And even after Littlefinger's like, they can still treat you like crap, she's still like, this is my home. I just don't get why she's so insistent on staying here. I know you loved it here last year, but you've literally been struggling to survive since your dad died. There's no reason for this except because the plot needs her to stay here. Otherwise, her established character dictates that she would choose to leave. They didn't do any groundwork to give Sansa really strong ties to the community of King's Landing. It's not like she thinks she's making a difference or she has all these amazing friends here. She's literally a prisoner, and now she's rejected the second chance to be free.
Look around you. We're all liars here, and every one of us better than you.
This dialogue falls a bit flat. I don't think the word liar really works here, and I definitely don't think he would characterize himself as a liar to Sansa. Also, this would have been a great opportunity to bring in his backstory just briefly, like I was the son of nobody and now I have Harrenhal, which is a quick tie back to earlier in the scene when Joffrey granted him the seat for his help. And then he could come in with his line, but instead say pretenders, because I think that word fits better with what he's trying to say. We're all pretenders, but you're not really able to get away with it yet. They cut away too fast. It should have rested a bit longer on Sansa so we could sit with the weight of what Littlefinger said before cutting to Roz. Plus, it would have really emphasized the thematic tie-in with Roz also being this pretender trying to climb the ladder of King's Landing, and doing so in part through Littlefinger.
I'm not like most men.
That's what most men say.
Tell me if working for Lord Baelish has been all you'd hoped it would be.
Have we met?
I think your true talents are wasted on them.
You're very kind, my lord. Allow me to return the favor.
You're afraid?
I know who you are.
I feel like there's a bit of infantilizing with the men in this show where they make it seem like they're just these harmless fools that are easily seduced by the women around them who all have these agendas up their sleeves, and the only one that hasn't really applied to so far is Joffrey, which is ironic because in truth, men are more likely to fall into the abused women camp like him than the seduced idiot camp like Theon, for example. And yeah, we get Ramsay later on, but he, like Joffrey, is depicted as off-the-rails crazy. So far, it seems like all the non-psychotic men in this show would literally set their friends on fire if they could get inside a woman, which is crazy because exactly what is your commentary here? The author's been told he writes strong women, but if you're saying don't underestimate women by suggesting they can trick men with sex, thereby stripping men at least a little bit of their accountability, is that really an accurate take? Even with Ned, he knew Cersei had something to do with Jon Arryn and Bran, but they still made him stupid enough to not be worried about a woman's wrath. Also remember a couple episodes ago, Cersei randomly said to Tyrion what makes Varys dangerous is he can't be seduced because he doesn't have anything down there. Of course, that's because she thought she had Tyrion's girl. Like even the likes of Tyrion Lannister go stupid when it comes to a girl, and we know Shae's gonna end up betraying him, so how does that look, right? Plus with Cersei telling Sansa last episode she couldn't possibly seduce Stannis, but regardless, seduction is a woman's best weapon. That's not inherently a problem because obviously Cersei's grown up in a world where seduction has become her survival mechanism, and it's not wrong for the show to have her think like that. But do they ever explore the topic beyond this? And especially with Roz feeling Varys has nothing down there and being like, oh, my usual tricks aren't gonna work. I've seen this done a lot better in Black Sails because the seduction stuff was specifically between the women of the brothel and their clientele, and anyone who comes to a brothel is more likely to be seduced into spelling secrets. And I'm sure there are more examples where it doesn't feel like what this show is doing, where even with Roz, Varys isn't typical brothel clientele. And look, I'm just bringing this up for discussion's sake. I'm not saying this applies to every character in this show, but it's kind of hard to really speak on that after only 2 seasons. So hopefully after I've seen the whole thing again, I'll have a better grasp on the way men and women are written in this show.
I protect those who work for me. I don't abuse them to satisfy royal whims or force them to abuse each other.
Oh, do you know about that?
I thought you said you knew who I was. Littlefinger looks at you and sees a collection of profitable holes. I see a potential partner.
I'm afraid
afraid of him.
That line kinda sucks, and it's way too blunt. I would have preferred her to not say anything at all, especially with the way Varys has set up this conversation, and double especially because we had that conversation with Roz and Littlefinger back in episode 2, so the groundwork for this scene is there. She doesn't have to say she's afraid of him. We'll just be able to know from her demeanor and that prior scene that this is the case.
But everyone has their weaknesses. Your current employer hides his very well, but not as well as he thinks.
That scene ended really suddenly. I think it would have helped if the previous scene where Littlefinger gets Harrenhal, we got maybe a look exchanged between him and Varys that sets up for this. It's interesting for him to talk about Littlefinger's weakness, which, like I mentioned before, he's another man whose weakness is a woman. But it would have been really nice if they were able to go from Varys saying that line about he doesn't hide his weaknesses as well as he thinks, to then Littlefinger chasing down Sansa. The way they did these two back-to-back scenes was fine on its own, especially since the Littlefinger Sansa scene was added right onto the end of the big group scene, but it could have been interesting if we maybe had Sansa smile, then had Littlefinger watch Sansa leave, then cut to Roz and Varys' scene, and then cut back to Littlefinger finding Sansa in her room, which first of all, that ups the creepiness factor, and second of all, they can have that same conversation, but away from prying ears. However, going with this version would then take away the transition from we're all liars/pretenders, in my version, to the Roz Varys scene, and to a less severe extent, would take away my version of the scene with Littlefinger referring to Harrenhal, and how they're all pretenders, a bit further away from the context in which it was closest to, if that makes sense. This is a great example of how writing is often about choices and sacrifices, and doing one great thing might mean that you have to give up doing another great thing.
You're a virgin, I take it. Some boys like a challenge. Maybe you wished one of them could overpower you, fling you down, tear off your clothes. I'm strong enough.
Not interested.
Of course you are. You'd love to know what it feels like to be a woman.
Jaime just isn't funny, man. Every single time we see him with Brienne, it's like, oh, you ugly virgin man-like creature. Like, shut up, dude. The only girl you've ever been with is your own sister, so maybe you shouldn't be talking. And if I was Brienne, I'd maybe point that out because she was there when Catelyn was talking to Jaime, and Jaime was like, I may have been with my sister, but I've only ever been with her, whereas Ned slept with another woman.
Burying them. We shouldn't stay here. We should get back on the river.
Traveling a prisoner.
Got a woman.
Oh, ha ha ha, she's a woman. That's so funny. Remember how I said this show can't discuss gender? It feels like a show written with modern cultural context. It's too bad Black Sails and The Last Kingdom came after this season, otherwise GOT could have taken some notes, because those shows can discuss gender in a way that feels grounded within the time period. And I've mentioned this before in this series, that's probably because they're historical fiction, so the writers actually needed to do the appropriate research in order to lay that groundwork.
Who are you fighting for?
The Starks.
Why not kill him? Well, Steve the pig. Sending him with you. How important could he be? Have it your way, my lady. Do I know you? What do you think of these beauties?
I hope you gave them quick deaths.
2 of them we did, yeah. I do know you.
If this is the Kingslayer, I think I'd know about it.
I was at Whispering Wood. They dragged him out of the woods and threw him down before the king.
I think it's a little convenient that this one dude just happened to be at the one battle where he happened to get the perfect glimpse of Jaime Lannister, who he's never seen before, but I can move past that.
I have a question for you both, and I want you to answer at the same time. I count to 3, you both answer. What's his name? 2, 3.
Damn, Brienne, get him.
2 quick deaths.
See, you don't need that moment of them laughing at her in order for this to have impact, and they still could have shown Jaime underestimating her for her gender, but without that overt dialogue that made it obvious that the writers wanted to tell you what the scene's about, rather than just letting you watch it. Jaime might be a dick, but that stuff felt over the top, specifically for the purpose of him realizing, wow, I didn't expect that, once he sees Brienne fight. But that stuff aside, I really do like how this scene flowed. The overall build-up from them being like, what did this guy do, to the guy recognizing him, to the other guy being like, I need you both to answer at the same time, pause, what's his name? Like, not even saying on the count of 3, tell me his name, but splitting up that line to create even more of a build-up, to then Brienne taking out the other 2 guys, and before she even says it, you know what we're calling back to, the 2 quick deaths. It's all just really well structured and paced.
Those were Stark, man.
I didn't serve the Starks. I served Lady Catelyn.
And this part is also why we didn't need Jaime being all weird, because earlier he didn't quite understand what kind of person Brienne was. He's for the Lannisters, so he thinks she's for the Starks, and here we have an organic callback to that earlier moment. Having to kill Stark men to protect Jaime is a great way to build her character and to show Jaime what she's all about. And notice how she didn't kill them for what they did to the girls, because that wasn't her job. I feel like people might misconstrue that because of how she took them out, and the fact that she wanted to pay her respects by burying the girls, but when the dude showed up, she just wanted to get out of there without spilling blood, even though she knew she could have taken them out, like she did later. So this one scene tells us a lot about her. Not only is she loyal, and loyal to Catelyn specifically, but her loyalties translate into putting her duties first.
Walder Frey is a dangerous man to cross.
I know that.
And you mean to do it anyway.
And that is what would be in store for me with one of Walder Frey's daughters. What you and father had.
Why not? Because she's not beautiful.
No, you're arguing just to argue. Because you arranged it.
Man, just shut up and sit down.
And you agreed to it.
Exactly. Like, remember last season, Rob was like, is there any other way? And Catelyn was like, not if you want to cross. And Rob said, then I consent.
Treat your oaths recklessly and your people will do the same.
And the only parent I have left has no right to call anyone reckless.
I know Catelyn loves her kids and she's not trying to push buttons since Rob's mad at her for letting Jaime go, but she needs to smack some sense into this boy. In fact, she and Ned should have raised Rob to understand that as heir of Winterfell, his marriage would be arranged because that's just how their society specifically works. It reminds me of King Alfred from The Last Kingdom, kingdom based on a real king when he had to marry off his 2 kids. His daughter understood that her marriage was basically her job so that she could help keep the kingdoms united, but his son didn't take it seriously at all. So Alfred basically had to be like, shut up and sit down, because being a king is not a hobby, it's your job, it's your duty. So it's really annoying that in this show, which has marriages between noble houses to create alliance, and has previously established the importance of that in this episode alone, that Rob would somehow not grasp the importance of that. Of course, there's also the he's young and dumb excuse, and when he promised to marry the Frey's daughter, he might not have fully grasped what he was signing up for. Just like Jon was told, you think you're cool with giving everything up for the Night's Watch, but are you really? And now that he's in it, he might be learning otherwise. But in Rob's case, he heard from several people last season and this season, the Freys cannot be trusted, and don't cross Walder Frey. Like, you're smart enough to be winning these battles by not underestimating your opponents, which you proved last season by not agreeing to fight Jaime Lannister, and also earlier this season by telling him you didn't trust your own men around him, but now you're ready to screw someone who everyone's been telling you cannot be trusted for a girl you met 2 weeks ago? They did the exact same thing with Ned last season. They set him up in one way, and then later contradicted everything they established about his character for the sake of the plot. And I get Rob's at a low point. He lost his dad, the entire war is on his shoulders, his mom betrayed him, at least in his eyes, Theon screwed him, and so Winterfell's lost, his siblings are all far away, and he even says to Talisa in episode 8, my mom screwed me, Theon screwed me, this sucks. But the show isn't actually suggesting that he's doing this out of vulnerability and the need to connect with someone. They're suggesting he's doing it because he really likes this girl and thinks she's the one. They're not even showing him struggle with the prospect of having to go back on his word. He's just like, shut up mom, I'm marrying her. Like, oh my god, dude. It's almost the reverse of Joffrey. And speaking of, remember earlier this season I said there seemed to be an unintentional parallel between the 2 boy kings and having their mothers behind them? It still feels like a missed opportunity to not really develop that, because once again, there's a possibility with this right here. But regardless, I just feel that in general, this season, Rob could have used some more development on how he's actually dealing with this war. We got glimpses of it, especially in his conversations with his mom, but instead of trying to push him into this marriage, I wish the show had instead tried to develop how Rob's dealing with being the king in the north and this huge weight on his shoulders. Really nice transition.
You said you saw my victory in the flames.
I still see it.
And I'm no better than a savage, trusting in a fire god. I led my men to the gates of the 7th hell, as their brothers burnt alive, and for what? Show me how you fight.
Why doesn't it surprise me to see Stannis choking a woman? Honestly though, is she not going to point out that Stannis was the one who chose to buy into all this? This is why we would have benefited a bit from seeing how Stannis was lured to the dark side. He doesn't even seem like this type of religious. He seems more like someone who would excommunicate family members for renouncing the gods that they grew up with. If the season had started with that same scene of him writing out letters about Joffrey's parentage, but then Melisandre came into his life, that might have helped out his character journey a bit. And then maybe over the course of the season, we would see that yes, he's already very much about his birthright and he'll do anything to get there, but we'll also see how the Red Priestess has him pushing his boundaries even further. He'll not only do anything to get there, but now he'll renounce his gods, he'll allow for dark magic if he thinks it's the only way, he'll kill his own brother, and while we get a glimpse of that earlier in the season with him thinking there's no way I can beat Renly except with dark magic, remember I said there wasn't really any time to develop that? We just kind of skipped right to him showing up and killing Renly? Because we didn't have that, it's weird that Stannis is here like, you promised you saw my victory. Like, you really went for this because a random lady saw your victory in the flames, and not because you had a massive fleet, all of your brother's bannermen, and some dark magic at your disposal? Like, the conversation just doesn't reflect what's been going on.
I murdered my brother.
For him to be like, I killed my brother for this, makes it seem like killing Renly was this massive sacrifice he made in order to ensure his victory. But earlier in the season, it wasn't depicted as that. It was depicted as if he was getting rid of someone he now considered an enemy. That's how the scenes were written before and after the fact. Otherwise, why didn't they show him struggle with what he would have had to do / what he did? And honestly, I don't think Stannis would be the type to struggle with that. So the error really lies in the writing of this scene. It just doesn't match up with what they've done with Stannis in the rest of the season.
You will betray everything you once held dear, and it will all be worth it.
And now Melisandre's here like, you'll betray everyone and it'll be worth it. This conversation would only work if Stannis had actually made some massive sacrifice only to lose the battle, but he hasn't.
We will sweep aside this pretender and that one.
Interesting for her to mention pretender, because earlier in the episode I said Littlefinger should have used that word, and if he had, this would have been a cool little thread.
You see, my king?
Yes.
Another great transition. Also, Stannis looking into the fire and finally seeing for himself after questioning, you promised these things but you don't actually know. This is a really big deal, but this isn't the right place for it. Like I said before, Stannis would have questioned this sort of thing a lot earlier in his relationship with Melisandre. And also, like I mentioned before, men in this show are so easily seduced by women, and like Cersei said, Stannis is the least likely to fall for that, which calls me back to episode 2 when he literally gets with her immediately, and quite intensely too. I think it's more in character for Stannis to learn over the course of this season that Melisandre and her magic are a means to an end rather than being seduced by her right off the bat and not questioning anything until it doesn't work out. Him seeing the truth in the fire should have come before he killed Renly, because this is a massive moment of commitment. He sees this for himself, and therefore he'll cross every line to get there. Also, if you remember last episode, Varys pointed out to Tyrion, you believe what you see, and what I've seen has been terrible. He was talking in reference to people like the Red Priestess and how it's terrible that Stannis has joined up with her. And now Stannis has to see something in order to believe it. So that's a pretty interesting parallel that I don't think was intentional, but if they had crafted it to be more intentional, that could have been really cool, especially with the idea of seeing is believing coming up previously with Maester Luwin telling Bran how he tried to study magic when he was younger, and Tyrion getting a note from the Wall about the crazy white situation, which everyone laughed at him for, and of course, people not believing in the dragons being back, or in them at all, like last season, even though I thought Jorah should have believed in dragons to begin with because they're historically a thing. He was like, I don't believe dragons because I only believe what I see, and then at the end of the season, when Dany had the baby dragons, he was like, oh my god, that's crazy. So this thread exists, but it's just not really developed super thoroughly over the course of the show, as far as I remember, and especially doesn't have any connection with any sort of theme. Like, what does this tell us about people? How does seeing then believing, or believing without seeing, or any combination of the two, impact the world and the people around them? Apart from, of course, Cersei's stubbornness with not believing in the White Walkers, and even then we know that the final season wasn't optimized for literally any thematic conclusions.
I want you to know you're surrounded. I know I'm surrounded. I know that. I stood on the battlements and saw I was surrounded.
The dialogue isn't super great so far, and that's because it feels like they're trying to catch us up on stuff we didn't see. I understand the need to skip it because of the timeline and because this is a more interesting entry point back into Theon's storyline, but it could have done with some tweaks in the dialogue.
First time I saw Winterfell, it looked like something that had been here for thousands of years. We never stood a chance against a man who lives here.
Lord Stark went out of his way to make it your home.
Yes, my captors were so very kind to me. You love reminding me of that.
This kind of dialogue again. Remember, we talked about how Theon hasn't felt like a captive until the plot called for it.
You know what it's like to be told how lucky you are to be someone's prisoner, and then to go back home to your real father.
For him to talk about everyone telling you you're lucky, you yourself said in the beginning of the season that Ned Stark raised you to be honorable. You considered yourself lucky, and it was Tyrion and Ros who said you're a prisoner last season, because the writers told them to. And now he's like, to hear that all your life and then go back to your father, and he literally gets interrupted? Dude, finish your thought, please, because we don't know what it's like. We haven't actually seen what that's like for you. All we know is you had it pretty good, and then you went home to your dad, and he was a dick to you. And despite you pointing out to him, hey, you're the one who gave me up, you're telling us now that somehow you came to the conclusion that you realized you weren't so lucky to be raised by the Starks because your dad hates who you became? Like, we're definitely missing some stuff here.
Wait for nightfall and run.
I'll never make it back to the Iron Islands, and even if I did, I'd be a coward.
Join the Night's Watch. Hidden passageways.
The opportunity for Jon Snow to cut my throat in my sleep.
The opportunity to make amends for what you've done.
I've done a lot, haven't I?
You're not the man you're pretending to be.
I've gone too far to pretend to be anything else.
I thought we were finally getting somewhere. The conversation was flowing a lot better, felt very organic. Maester Luwin telling him you could take the black and make amends. I've known you forever and you're pretending to be someone else. And then Theon answers with, yeah, but I've gone too far to pretend to be anything else. That doesn't really make sense. Like, you're acknowledging you're a pretender, which in this case means he's pretending to be this tough Iron Islander, but you're here hiding with Maester Luwin instead of with your Iron Islander buddies? And how are you gonna be like, yeah, I'm a pretender, but I've gone too far to take your way out? Like, that's literally not true. And by continuing to be this pretender, what are you supposed to do anyway? Like, at this point, they're at your gates, you're under siege, the food's gonna run out, like there's literally nothing left to do but run away. So you think you can pretend your way into not getting killed? Or you're cool with dying? As a side note, it's interesting for the show to bring up the concept of pretender again. That's twice in this episode, and I didn't even know about either of those instances when I said earlier Littlefinger should have said pretender.
Every Ironborn man is worth a dozen from the mainland. We die today, brothers. They will sing about the Battle of Winterfell until the Iron Islands have slipped beneath the waves. Mothers will name their sons for us. What is dead may never die.
It was a good speech. Didn't want to interrupt.
I mean, it was a good speech, I'll give them that. Too bad Theon was so quick to reject the people that truly accepted him and tried to gain the favor of those who did not, which is what makes this even more irritating. Like, I get he wanted to be the Lord of the Iron Islands after his dad, I get he wanted to be accepted by his own people, but you really thought these dudes would die for an unsanctioned hit on Winterfell? Honestly, I feel like given the way his conversation with Maester Luwin ended, it felt like off-screen Theon would have been ready to go out there and give a speech, and in that time, I'm sure Maester Luwin, as his advisor, would have brought up, hey, you really think those people would die for Winterfell? Do you really trust them when they got you into this mess? And let's talk about that for a sec, because the dude who knocks Theon out is the one who's been whispering all this poison in his ear. So isn't it partially his fault that they got trapped in Winterfell with no one to help them? After Theon got sorted by Yara, wouldn't it then make sense for him to tell this guy, hey, you really screwed me, you gotta help me get out of this? This guy's been telling him what to do for the past few episodes anyway, so why wouldn't he then tell him how to handle this situation? Like, what was this guy's goal? Because characters shouldn't be a plot device, they should actually have their own intrinsic motivations. If this guy isn't gonna tell Theon, hey, we all had a discussion and we agreed we're screwed and we should get get out of here, then why did he tell Theon to come here in the first place? Whether he wanted to genuinely help Theon win over his men, or he thought this Winterfell thing was a great opportunity and that Theon was somebody he could easily control, that doesn't line up with this scene. I don't think he intended to screw Theon from the get-go because the show didn't depict anything even close to that. And if he wanted to help Theon but then changed his mind because Theon's trying to do something nobody wants, then that also doesn't add up because he had time to tell Theon this is what we should do. And if then Theon was like, now we should die, he could still be like, well, they don't want to die for Winterfell because that's basically what he's been doing all along. And regardless if he had told Theon what to do, then I really doubt that Theon would be like, now we should die. He doesn't tell Theon what the Iron Islanders would want him to do. And it's all because the writers need Theon to get stuck with Ramsay Bolton.
What are you doing? Let's go home.
Sir Mandon Moore tried to kill you on your sister's orders. I'm afraid your friend has been relieved of his command of the city watch. The gold cloaks are now firmly in the hands of your father or your sister.
Then my hill tribesmen
Have gone home. Your father paid them quite handsome. I'm afraid we won't be seeing each other for some time.
And I thought we were friends.
We are. Podrick, would you mind?
It's crazy how fast everything changed overnight. Cersei commanding this dude to make sure Tyrion died in battle is wild, and honestly, I don't see that from her because as far as she knows, she thinks she has leverage on Tyrion in the form of Ros. And Tyrion was supposed to be acting hand until Tywin came back from dealing with Robb. Sure, Cersei might not have liked Tyrion having so much power, but remember in episode 7, they sort of reached a tentative moment of not hating each other. And even without that, remember Cersei was literally down in the basement last episode like, if my stupid brother wins, it'll be a miracle. So she knew Tyrion was the only thing standing between her and Stannis. Why would she then try to have him killed even if she did hate him? And this reminds me, are we never going to talk about the fact that Cersei was literally having wildfire made for the battle and then Tyrion used it? Tyrion made sure she wouldn't find out, so what did she think the wildfire was being used for if she didn't tell anyone? Did she think Joffrey would handle battle plans? Because earlier in episode 5, that conversation with Tyrion and Cersei about Renly's death, Cersei was basically like, you don't need to worry about any upcoming battle, which is what prompted Tyrion to go find out what she was hiding. Because she made it sound like she and Joffrey had this plan to deal with Stannis, and Tyrion found out that the plan was wildfire. So then what happened to that? Like overall, it just feels like we skipped some development for Cersei to forget about that and also to get to the point of trying to make sure Tyrion died in battle. Especially because suggesting she would kill Tyrion over him sending Myrcella away and having Joffrey in the vanguard and having more power in the moment even though it's only temporary, it's honestly ridiculous. Like yeah, he caught Pycelle and he kicked him out of the council, so what? They're only doing this to fast track her villain arc. For the show to insinuate Cersei's just ready to kill people at the drop of a hat is a really weak way to create a villain, especially because we know she's able to get her way without going there. Remember, she was willing to let Ned live and didn't default to killing him, and yeah, that's because she trusted that he wouldn't say anything, and she knew that keeping him alive was much better for her and her family than if he died. And while this doesn't exactly translate to what's going on with Tyrion, because the situation's kind of different, just remember she has Ros, who she thinks is Tyrion's weakness. She had this whole power is power thing in episode 1, which I said I hoped they would develop because her understanding of power is not entirely correct or complete, and maybe it would have been nice to see her figure out how to maneuver the people around her, though of course she didn't actually get a ton of screen time this season compared to other characters, but trying to kill her brother who's merely standing in for Tywin, as I've said 10 times already, it just doesn't work, regardless of all the bad blood between them, because she had absolutely nothing to gain from him dying. It strips their relationship of all nuance. In fact, she thought she would probably die during Blackwater, and she was fully prepared for it. So despite that, she still arranged for her brother to be killed, even though if things were bad enough she would either die by Stannis' men or from the poison, then that would mean that Tyrion probably would have been killed as well anyway, in the battle. So all this feels like the show trying to create a massive and permanent rift between Tyrion and his family right away, rather than developing that organically over a longer period of time. The groundwork for Cersei and Tywin not liking Tyrion is there, sure, but it's not quite at this level yet. Also, Tyrion got slashed and immediately he's demoted, Bronn's demoted, everyone works for Cersei and Tywin, like damn, okay. But in this instance, the immediacy actually works, especially with Tyrion finding out like this. It creates a bigger impact by highlighting how everything turned upside down for Tyrion so quickly. It's just the Cersei tried to have you killed part that doesn't work. Sure, it's more dramatic to be like, not only have you been stripped of everything, but your own sister tried to have you killed. But when that development hasn't been there, I'd rather his injury come from a Stannis supporter. Final point about the scene, remember last season when Ned got screwed over by Cersei? Varys was the only one who showed up to help, and now it's Tyrion. I think it's interesting that earlier this season they went out of their way to draw a distinction between Tyrion and Ned, and across several conversations with Varys especially, and with Tyrion trying to weed out the people who screwed Ned. Plus also being like, Ned Stark is honorable and I'm not, and also Ned hated the game but Tyrion loves it. And now Tyrion is in the same boat, having been betrayed by Cersei and with no power, and Varys being the only one left in his corner, essentially. I wish they'd been better about this parallel, because in all those scenes except the getting rid of Janos Slynt one, it felt like checking a box rather than organically developing the parallel. Regardless, I'm curious to see how we go from here and how they further develop the parallel, and when and how that parallel diverges.
I'm a monster, as well as a dwarf. You should charge me double.
You think I'm here for money?
I pay you and you lie to me.
I'm a poor little rich man and nobody loves me, so I make jokes all the time and pay them to laugh. They try to kill you, they will try again. Going into wars, fighting soldiers, you're terrible at this. You don't belong here.
This is is the first time I actually like Shay's dialogue to Tyrion. I don't like his dialogue to her, but progress is progress.
Do belong here. These bad people are what I'm good at. Out-talking them, out-thinking them, and I like it.
Of course, he will end up having to go east exactly 2 seasons from now, so I'm curious to see the development of his mindset. Like, of course he'll leave after being sentenced to die, but there needs to be some intrinsic change by then. He believes he belongs here specifically because he's good at dealing with bad people and enjoys out-talking and out-thinking them. Don't love that specific dialogue. I thought he'd say something like, I make a difference here. There are people who depend on me. They might not know they do, but they do. And honestly, I enjoy outplaying these people. And then, of course, over the next 2 seasons, he would then come to realize that no amount of him being here could possibly overpower these bad people. And so he'd have to switch gears. And then when he goes to Dany, he would then realize that he's no longer in a place where he can outthink people. He's no longer somewhere where he can do what he's best at. And he'll have to overcome that struggle and realize that in order to truly make a difference to the people of King's Landing, he has to accept this new reality, back Dany, and learn what it takes to truly be Hand of the King, or in this case, Queen. Because in this season, while he did do a lot of good work, he ultimately wasn't able to fully be Hand of the King because the king wouldn't listen to him. So if he comes to realize that Dany's what's best for King's Landing, then he also has to figure out how to best advise her in a way where he'll be heard.
You going to leave?
I am yours, and you are mine.
This is the first time I actually buy Shay and Tyrion's love for each other. After he's lost everything, Shay chooses to stay with him, and him seeing that, it means a lot to him. So it makes sense now for them to have this love. Unfortunately, the scene still sort of feels devoid of emotion. The music is trying to make up for that, but the writing just isn't able to quite convey that feeling.
In the sight of the Seven for eternity.
Really interesting to transition from that to this secret wedding. I think it flowed really nicely to go from Tyrion and Shay's commitment to each other to then this literal act of commitment for Robb and Talisa. However, I'm honestly really annoyed that Robb married her without thinking twice. Like, for some reason, I didn't remember when they would get married. I thought it might probably happen early next season, but it happened in this episode. He was just talking to his mom 2 minutes ago and he just went and married her right away. I know he's still really young and inexperienced in life, but based on how his character has been established, I don't think he would be this rash. He met Talisa in episode 4, and they had a few conversations where they seemed to like each other but still disagreed on some stuff. And then she tells him her life story and he's like, bam, I want to marry you, and does it next week. Rather than feeling like he really struggled between keeping his word and his growing feelings for Talisa, even from as soon as he got them, because he knew he was already promised to another, this instead feels like someone in the writer's room said, hey, we gotta move this along and get these 2 hitched so they can die next season because of this decision. And also from Talisa's point of view, she does not seem like the type to marry a guy who's already been promised to another, especially when she just told Robb her purpose in life was to be helping injured and sick people. Like, if you marry this dude, you're gonna have responsibilities as Lady of Winterfell. Then again, despite the show acting like it's medieval fact and showing it how it really was, the responsibilities of being Lady of Winterfell are pretty much non-existent. In real medieval history, noble ladies in positions of power didn't just sit around knitting and planning parties like Talisa said they did in episode 8. They had actual responsibilities. If this show was genuinely based on real medieval life for the sake of showing people how it was back then the Lord and Lady of Winterfell would have different responsibilities in terms of making sure their people were doing well. But unfortunately, this show has already been set up to suggest that women in this society have no purpose other than being married off, and people like Brienne are out here breaking these crazy rules, and that's a big deal. Even in the pilot of this show, Ned was the one with responsibilities, and Catelyn was just there as support. Robb said to Talisa his dad said being in charge was like having a ton of children to look out for. So that's another example of how he didn't share that responsibility with Catelyn. She only exists to be a mom, and while it's not a problem to have a character whose primary goals and motivations are motherhood and advising or looking out for their children, don't act like that's the norm or expectation for every woman in this time period. Because even though it is a fictional fantasy made-up world, the author himself has said this series was built to show people how it really was back then, and unfortunately, he and the writers of the TV show didn't actually do the research to actually support that. Now, Catelyn actually has been written pretty well this season, which shows you that you can still have a character like this, but then stick with it. Treat her like a real person with real decisions to make. Earlier in the season, with freeing Jaime, the writers pretty much made her decision for her, and now they're not letting Catelyn do what her character would genuinely do, which is go to Talisa and be like, if you let my son break a promise to a dangerous man, you would literally be screwing this whole kingdom, but especially my family. Of course, if that happened, Talisa, based on how her character has been established this season, wouldn't marry Robb, and the writers would need to find an actual, organic way for the phrase to betray Robb. But just like I was saying earlier this episode, the men in the show just seem to lose their minds for women, and like I'll be talking about further into the show, the women seem to be losing their minds for their children, except for Talisa, who only exists for Robb's downfall. It feels so strange to be returning to the Dany storyline now. Like, this is the first time we're seeing them in this episode, and it's over the halfway mark. Like, I just wish the storyline in the East was better tied in with the storyline in the West. If not in terms of plot, then at least thematically on some level, and in terms of episode structure.
You trying to frighten me with magic tricks? Here I am! You afraid of a little girl?
building some sense of suspense by having them go around in this big circle and then Jorah trying to keep up and then Dany completely disappearing. I think that was well done, but the dialogue when she's inside was a little weak. Also, saying little girl and cutting to Arya is definitely a good choice, but I don't think it was intentional because of the camera movements on either side. I think it could have been a stronger transition if she said that line, then heard the screech while we stay on a closer shot, and then have the sound of the screech carry over to either a closer shot of Arya or a wide of all three of them walking to sort of convey the emptiness of the land with the screech echoing over it.
How did you kill those guards? I want to be able to do it too.
If you would learn, you must come with me. The girl has many names on her lips. Names to offer up to the Red God. She could offer them all.
I need to find my brother and mother, and my sister.
Then we must part. Just give that coin to any men from Bravos. Farewell, Arya Stark.
Once again, as with almost every Arya scene this season, it's top-notch writing. From the overall structure and progression of the scene to the little details like Arya pausing before adding she needs to find her sister, it's a really well-written scene.
That's what medicine to get from your chambers. It'll make you better. They burned everything.
Pack as much food as you can carry and go north. There are too many enemies in the south. Go to the wall. To Jon.
I pulled you into the world. I've seen both your faces almost every day since. For that, I consider myself very lucky.
I think people might wonder if it's convenient Maester Luwin survived long enough to talk to Bran and Rickon, but the truth is, a stab wound to the stomach wouldn't kill you right away. It makes sense that probably not too much time has passed since then, maybe like an hour or two. I'm wondering why he didn't at least try to keep pressure on the wound to survive long enough, because death in this case would come from the massive blood loss, but it's not really important. Everything depends on context and execution. The purpose of this scene is to give Maester Luwin the chance to say goodbye to the two people that need him most right now. Yeah, he also has to tell them to go north to Jon, but the real purpose of this scene is saying goodbye. Otherwise, the writers would have had him tell Asha earlier maybe y'all should get out of this place and head to Jon, and then killed him off and had Bran and the gang just find him dead. This scene allows his death to pack more of an emotional punch rather than just feeling like, oh wow, this dude just died. It's a well-written scene. It's quick and to the point, but also substantial enough to feel like a weighted moment for the boys, especially given how integral he's been to them with both their parents and all their siblings not around for the past year. He deserves to have that moment with them before his story ends.
You must protect them. You may have to protect them against your own kind.
I got no great love for my own kind.
Do it quickly.
Then to have this quick moment with him and Asha is also really important, especially with him asking her to give him a quick death so he doesn't sit here bleeding out for hours. It shows sort of a transition from him to her as guardian of the boys, which works well because the show has been developing her relationship with them, especially with Bran, and also a relationship between her and Maester Luwin from the moment they met. This scene even sets up the possibility of Asha seeing the wildlings again and having to face everything she's been running from. However, none of this matters because Asha won't be going with them anyway. I don't remember if she takes them to the wall and then doubles back, or if she lets them go on their own. I have to imagine it's the first, but regardless, this is yet another example of the show doing a great job setting something up and then scrapping it almost immediately. Every time we cut back to Dany, it just feels so strange because it has nothing to do with anything else going on in the rest of the episode. This is really interesting. I don't know if they knew right here that they were looking at their final season, or if this was just made up as part of this vision that gets shown to her, and then they recreated that season 8 scene to match this, but I'm curious to see what this means. And then to have her cross through the door through the wall, which we know she'll be crossing in season 7, to get to a hut with her dead husband and son, either this was foreshadowing or retroactively planned to match the idea that Dany crossing over the wall would bring her closer to death. Not literally representing her death, but that the door through the wall leads to the White Walkers, which is the undead. Of course, all this is the Warlock trying to keep Dany from getting to her dragons and her resisting the temptation to gain what she's always wanted, the Iron Throne, and to regain what she lost, which is her family, both the Targaryens as represented by the throne room and Drogo and her kid, resisting them all to answer the call of her dragons. It shows that as of right now, what matters most is her dragons. So I'm curious to see how this is developed going forward and how this ties into her character journey and how she goes about pursuing the Iron Throne and regaining some sense of family.
Your dragons were born. Our magic was born again. It is strongest in their presence, and they are strongest in yours.
So this is interesting. Earlier in the season, Maester Luwin was talking about magic was maybe a big force once, but not anymore. The dragons are gone, children of the forest are gone, etc. And I said since the dragons were back, that meant that magic will probably be slowly reintroduced to the rest of the world. But now this looks like it's literal, because the guy said their magic is back specifically because of the dragons, and that their magic is stronger if the dragons are closer. That's a little weird, because we know magic exists in other forms around the world, like White Walkers and the Faceless Men, who have obviously existed this whole time. And like I said earlier in this season, all this stuff about magic doesn't seem to be leading anywhere in the grand scope of things. But at the very least, this extremely weird and ridiculous plotline with the Warlock seems to have some correlation to that scope.
You will be with them. They'll come home.
Dracarys.
Well, that was really fast. Not really a well-crafted scene, not really any build-up or anything, not really any struggle. She just shows up, and he chains her, and Dracarys, and we move on.
Never swung a sword before, have you? You look like a baby with a rattle.
They can give Manch Raider an invitation to Castle Black. Let them fight!
We are the Watchers on the wall.
Again, this was also really fast, and it wouldn't have felt like this if it had been in the same episode as the one where they get caught and Qhorin Halfhand pretends to get mad at him for the first time, because structurally that would have felt more appropriate. To have that whole storyline of Jon and the Halfhand in the Wildlings' custody as part of one episode, and having this one cohesive trajectory for the episode's Jon storyline. Also, the Halfhand just died in service of the Night's Watch, but just a few episodes ago he was like, this job is the last line of defense for humanity. Just kidding, it's not that deep. And he just died for this job, so maybe it would have been nicer for that conversation to be a bit different. Even though it was a good conversation, it should have been more in line with this right here in order to build his character and set up for this moment. Because letting Jon kill him so Jon can become a double agent to take down these really bad people that Qhorin Halfhand knows all about, that's a really big deal. You sacrificed yourself for the greater good. So that earlier conversation could definitely have reflected that a bit more. Or even done without that later part where he's like, psych, that's just what we tell ourselves to feel important. I definitely buy that he's the type to save Jon however he can, especially if that's going to help them take down Mance Rayder, but I would have liked to see some more development for him. Like maybe he had some sort of connection with or great respect for Ned Stark that we didn't hear about that affirmed the importance of what he needs to do and gives him this innate sense of I need to mentor Jon, in which case it would have been great to get some discussion between Qhorin and Jon about Ned back before they set out on this journey. Just needed a bit more of those two connecting in the episodes before and during them setting out that could have strengthened the groundwork for this. And even more so because it's definitely a big moment that Jon couldn't kill Ygritte but was able to kill Qhorin Halfhand, the guy he looked up to and has been his mentor. So it would have been nice for that relationship to be more developed prior to this so that it could amplify the gravity of this situation. Because it really was do or die. And now that his hand was forced and he had to kill him to survive and symbolically kill the person he stopped from killing the person who's now going to be his intro to the wildling life, it's going to be interesting to see how Jon grapples with this major character moment.
You can tell, man, that's the man who killed Qhorin Halfhand.
Her line was really unprovoked and random. I get the purpose is to show that this is a big deal for the wildlings and that Ygritte is low-key trying to make sure Jon survives, but it just feels thrown in there. I would rather they have had that line when they introduced Jon to Mance and then they can be like, hey, this is the guy that killed Qhorin Halfhand.
Khaleesi, please. You said you'd never leave Kath alive. Come. Nothing. Thank you for teaching me this lesson.
We can take the Iron Throne. I'll bring you 1,000 ships.
Okay, so that happened, and that's over. Not sure I really care. Didn't really feel impactful, because it should be a big deal that Dany's own friend and helper is in the bed of her enemy. But it almost feels like there's a deleted scene where either the audience or Dany found out about her prior to this confrontation. And beyond that, the scene just generally felt like, okay, get them out of bed, get into the vault, and we're done. Just kind of flat.
Real enough to buy a ship?
Small ship.
So that's interesting. In episode 5, she condemned members of her Khalasar for wanting to steal from the place they were guests in, and now she's taking everything from them. The problem is, in that episode, she had this attitude like they're stealing because they're savages, and now it's like they're stealing from the guy who wronged them. So it doesn't really work as the reversal that the writers think it does. The Dothraki were still depicted in a negative and uncivilized light in that episode, and her taking this stuff in this episode is written to feel like it's now justified. I mean, I think it's smart to take this stuff, but then don't have that earlier scene of making the Dothraki look bad just to give Dany a big character moment. It's not like she changed her mind on the concept of stealing from your guests. This taking is completely justified. But it feels like they wanted to put that in there to show that, oh, Dany's becoming more like the Dothraki. And knowing where her story ends up and the Mad Queen and her going crazy and all of that, remember I said last season it would look really bad for them to be like either the Mad Queen stuff stemmed from this instrumental and character defining time she has with the Dothraki, and the context was similar because back then she didn't blink twice when she and Drogo were basically getting their revenge on Viserys, and so here she's also kind of getting her revenge on this guy. So the context of her doing these actions is justified, and the context of Dothraki without Dany's added presence doing stuff that Dany would not approve of is not justified. Like not only the stealing earlier in this season, but also last season with them raiding all these places and her stepping in and be like, don't do that, that's a terrible thing to do. I don't know if this makes sense, but it's like at the same time they're showing Dany getting a little messy because of the Dothraki, but also at the same time it feels a bit white savior because when she is getting messy like the Dothraki, it just so happens to be in a situation where it's justified. Does that make sense? I don't know, I'm just trying to think of how this fits into the overall story that we know exists for Dany, and since I don't remember what happens between now and the Mad Queen, it's going to be hard for me to really be able to say exactly what the writers were trying to do. Cutting back and forth between Essos and Beyond the Wall for the last 15 minutes feels a bit weird because suddenly the entire Westeros storyline hasn't been active. Overall, the balance in this episode hasn't been great. It was better earlier on, but then ever since Dany came back for her second scene, it just felt really uneven. I think they should have started cutting to Dany earlier in the episode, ended her storyline, and then cut to the Bran, Asha, Maester Luwin stuff because contextually it works really well to go from Dany's Khalasar stealing stuff to the destroyed Winterfell. And then after dealing with Maester Luwin's death and leaving Winterfell, they could then cut to the Beyond the Wall stuff for the rest of the episode because again, contextually, Bran and the gang are heading to the wall.
I thought we were coming north to fight wildlings. People shouldn't live anywhere you need to burn shit to keep warm.
The thing about Gilly that's so interesting is she's bloody killed. After all that Craster's done to her, she's still got hope that life might get better.
The thing about Gilly, she said 6 words to you.
The thing about you that I found so interesting is absolutely nothing.
And the thing I find interesting about this conversation is absolutely nothing. I get they need some regular conversation before the horns come in, but they could have been talking about literally anything else. It started off fine with them talking about having to dig latrine pits instead of fighting wildlings, and then Sam could have added on to that, like maybe he doesn't think it's so bad and that Jon and the others would probably have it worse. And then they could have even been like, what do you think was that weird thing we found back in episode 8? Sam randomly coming in with Gilly talking about it's interesting she's so hopeful after being abused just really rubs me the wrong way, because first of all, was she hopeful? No, she was just trying to get out of a really bad situation. Second of all, while hope is obviously very important, Sam seems to be treating it like, oh, good for her, keeping her chin up despite the rape. And third of all, he only says this because the writers were like, let's show how obsessed he is with Gilly in one line, even though he hasn't talked about her since they left Craster's Keep. Instead of him actually continuing to bring up Gilly over and over across his scenes, they're basically telling us, oh, he talks about Gilly a lot by having him bring her up and have the other guys be like, oh, not this again. So even though it might feel like they're showing us his obsession, this still falls under the telling category because the show is telling us he won't shut up about Gilly instead of actually showing him not shutting up about Gilly for several scenes. Also, if they'd done that in the prior scenes, this conversation could have been more focused and relevant, especially with what's about to come next.
It's on the half hand.
Two blasted wildlings. Not fighting them alone. Come on. 3 blasts.
Really love that they set this up earlier in the season without drawing too much importance to it, and these guys were in that same scene when we got that information, so now in this scene, they kind of represent us when we hear each of the horns. The first one, it's like, oh, that means rangers. Second one, oh crap, wildlings, and they're getting ready for a fight, which reflects what we're thinking. And then we hear that third horn, and everybody stops. So that's just really well done. Not sure who sounded the horn, because that would mean that they would have had to see the White Walkers, but I guess that's the least of anyone's concerns, right? Well, that's a wrap on season 2. First things first, that ending was kind of crazy. I've noticed the VFX in this episode, like the Beyond the Wall scenes and some of the Dany scenes weren't the best, but I could look past it. However, there was just something about the scene that felt so strange, and I think it's mostly because the color design feels mismatched. Like even with the non-CGI stuff, from that shot of Sam against the wall panning up to this blizzard, then some of those early whites looking like a completely different tonal palette in contrast to Sam, then the design of the White Walker, even though it looked real, it just looked kind of silly, honestly. Like I couldn't take it seriously even though the camera direction did a good job by cutting in so close. And then the final shot of them marching towards the wall, again, just felt kind of off with the coloring not feeling like it was a consistent tone between the crowd of whites and the backdrop. Like whether it's something practical versus something CGI or two practical things versus each other, for example, Sam versus the whites behind him, in that one shot, the color tones just didn't feel cohesive. But content-wise, still a great way to end the episode and the season as a whole. It's a Song of Ice and Fire, so it's fitting that season 1 ended with fire and this one ends with ice. Overall though, the episode didn't really have the best pacing and structure. It honestly felt pretty slow for much of it, and then we got a bunch of scenes that just felt really quick. And like I said earlier, stacking all the Westeros stuff back to back and then just doing Dany and Beyond the Wall for the rest just felt jarring. The thing that's so weird about this show is that the White Walkers feel like the biggest problem, like it's this thing that they're leading up to, and yet in the books, it's barely a thing. I know it's been said that books are pretty much just about the politics of it all, and the main storyline and focus of the show being the Westeros stuff definitely reflects that, but it's called A Song of Ice and Fire, so that suggests that the White Walkers and the dragons are supposed to be a big deal. It suggests that Jon and Dany's storylines are a lot more important than they apparently feel right now, or that they'll become more important by the end. But either way, their storylines just aren't very well tied in with the rest of the show. Dany and the White Walkers may not be coming to Westeros for quite some time, and that's fine if we're watching a show where these two storylines are sort of playing back up to the stuff in Westeros for now, but it should still feel connected. And you can see especially in this episode and the way it was structured that despite a few instances of possible connections, it still mostly feels like 3 separate storylines. However, I did find this episode pretty interesting. It definitely sets up a lot of conflict for season 3, with Tyrion coming up against his family, Robb breaking his word to the Freys, Bran heading up to meet with Jon, who's not there because he's about to meet the Wildling army, and the White Walkers on their way to the wall. I was surprised we didn't check in with Davos this episode, but I understand they wanted to prioritize Stannis having his big moment and seeing his own victory in the flames. But even though this episode sets up upcoming conflicts, a lot of the issues in this episode stem from what came before. I won't be getting into these again since we talked about everything throughout this entire episode and in previous episodes, but there's Robb and Talisa's marriage, the sudden loss of power for Tyrion because of Cersei trying to kill him, Stannis' arc. All of these had some inconsistencies in their development, development. Then there's Catelyn, who was grappling with difficult choices, Joffrey was getting some more depth after being a one-dimensional sadist, and Sansa was learning to survive, but then we had some derailments and gaps there as well. Bran had some potential with his dreams and losing Winterfell, but it still felt like there was something missing. Jon was learning more about the world beyond the wall and learning to lead, which will come into the next season, but they also randomly brought up the idea of he doesn't know what he gave up when joining the Night's Watch, just to prematurely set up something for season 3 when it never really was developed earlier in this season. And especially Dany's storyline, I just felt like there was a lot of potential since they brought up things like her not really knowing how to lead and showing her mimicking what her brother used to say, but the actual plot and scenes were mostly pretty poorly written. And this episode really shows what this season felt like in terms of Dany's storyline, with interesting prospects like her rejecting the dreams of the Iron Throne and her family, but then this ridiculous plotline with the Warlock overshadowing that while also being wrapped up super quickly. It felt like her story was planned out to cover some points rather than one cohesive character journey. I know they had to make up some of it because of how little she was in the second book, but that shouldn't really matter because guess what else was made up? Almost everything with Arya and Tywin. I didn't realize until after watching either episode 7 or 8 that there are no Tywin Arya scenes in the entire book. Like, they don't even meet. She basically catches a glimpse of him at Harrenhal and that's pretty much it. So all of that was made up for the show. And guess what? It was really good. Great character development for both Arya and Tywin, great backstory development and world building as well, and a lot of really interesting stuff brought up in their conversations. Like, for example, Tywin saying Arya reminds him of Cersei and Arya bringing up stuff about the Targaryen sisters. These scenes could have felt like filler just thrown in to give Arya some screen time, but they didn't. Even though most of the time spent in these scenes wasn't strictly related to the overall plot, they were still really compelling. And even though Arya doesn't have this explicit character arc or a lesson she learns or anything like that, she still has a significant character journey as she experiences things and has these conversations. You can see she has a lot of built-up anger about the Lannisters, but also hopes and dreams for herself as she remembers the Targaryen sisters. This sort of character development exists to build, step by step, the person she's gonna become, whoever that might be. Character growth should feel gradual and organic like this. She's progressing as a human being and therefore she feels like a real human being. However, I worry that they won't really maintain this going forward because why don't we ever revisit these ideas again? And this is where the problem comes in. Because they don't meet in the books, there's nothing to follow through on. So the show doesn't build on what they've done with these two characters in this season because there's nothing to build on in the books. And for some reason, they don't want to make anything up. Like, if you're going to deviate from the books anyway, then commit to that and build upon what you've already done before. Why not do more when Arya meets Dany? Why not do more with the Arya-Cersei parallel that Tywin brought up? And it doesn't matter that the last 2 books haven't been written because y'all have been going off the author's notes for those books and you've been deviating from the books anyway. I know people think the show got worse as they deviated from the books, but as of right now, I don't really think that's the issue, especially because the overall writing of this season was so much stronger and a massive improvement from last season. While season 1, it felt like they were just telling us stuff we needed to know, this season had a craft to it. And despite some of the issues I mentioned earlier, it just felt a lot more interesting and immersive. We were learning information, but in much more compelling ways. Scene writing and episodic writing overall were so much better. Last season mostly felt like a slog to get through, while this season, every episode felt like it was worth watching except episode 8. We also, finally, got into some of the thematic potential, with ideas around magic and religion and belief, and ideas around what power looks like and feels like, though I don't know what the development of this will look like going forward. And despite the character problems I mentioned, the overall character and relationship development in this season was done quite well. There were definitely some questionable plot decisions like Renly dying so early, and some areas that would have done better with more planning and development like we've talked about, but ultimately it's been a pretty strong season. Hopefully I've covered everything I wanted to cover. I didn't realize how long today's commentary would run, or that much of the overall season commentary would be in the actual episode reaction itself, but at the risk of crossing into no man's land, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap this up. I do want to give a quick notice that this rewatch series will be going on hiatus. I just don't have the time right now to be making so many videos, and it was either prioritized doing this show exclusively or talking about a wide variety of stuff. And I chose the latter because there's so much I want to talk about on this channel but haven't been able to just because of how much time this series takes. But this hiatus isn't permanent, so I want to thank you guys for watching this with me so far, and I'll definitely be returning to this as soon as I'm able. So for right now, let me sign off, and I'll see you in the next one.